from whom alone cometh all counsel, wisdom, and understanding. We, thine unworthy servants, here gathered together, in thy name do most humbly beseech thee to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and guide us in all our consultations. And grant that we, having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside all private interests, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsel may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace, and tranquility of the islands, and uniting and knitting together of all hearts of person and estate within the same, in true Christian love and charity one to another. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
This Honourable House now resume its sittings. Call of the roll.
Mr. Witter, Mr. Holness, Dr. Clark, Mr. Shaw, Dr. Chang, Mr. Montague, Ms. Grange, Mr. Henry, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Daryl Bass, Mr. Warmington, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Hutchinson, Dr. Wheatley, Dr. Tufton, Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Malahufort, Mr. Spencer, Mr. Green, Mr. Terry Long, Mr. Main, Mr. Arscott, Mr. Azan, Dr. Bloomfield, Mr. Brown, Dr. Brownberg, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Leslie Campbell, Mr. Clark, Mr. Shaw, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Leslie Campbell, Mr. Clark, Mr. Tufton, Dr. Tufton, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Miss Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Golding, Dr. Guy, Miss Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kellier, Dr. McNeil, Miss Nito, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Clark, Mr. Campbell, pardon me. Mr. Paulwell. Mr. Paulwell. Mr. Michael Phillips. Dr. Phillips. Mr. Pickersgill. Mr. Redmond. Mr. Azan. Mr. Robertson. Mr. Robinson. Mr. Stewart. Reverend Thwaites. Mr. Dwayne Francis. Dwayne Vaz. Mr. Wright.
Statements by ministers.
Mr. Speaker, we expect to have a statement made by the Honourable Prime Minister today. He has not yet arrived, so I would ask that you proceed and we can ask for a recommittal when he arrives. Thank you very much.
Mr. Speaker, just by usual, the agenda for today's meeting was actually sent out this afternoon to the members. And I just really want to urge again that we try to sign off on the agenda, especially with myself on a Monday, which is the norm, and not for it to extend into the Tuesday as it has been doing. And I'm just urging that we do that. We revert to that.
Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House today
Order,
are the
please.
following. Minister Paper number 67, Annual Report of the Betting, Gaming and Lotteries Commission. Annual Report of the Betting, Gaming and Lotteries Commission for the year ended March 31, 2016. Ministry Paper number 68, entitled Solving Global Tourism Challenges Through the Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center. Annual Report and Audited Financial Statements of the Jamaica Urban Transit Company Limited for the year 2015-2016.
Bills brought from the Senate. Petitions. Papers. Reports from committees. Notices of motions given orally. Questions and answers to questions.
Mr. Speaker, I could not allow this to pass without noting the fact that there are no questions to be answered. They have all been answered by the government.
Mr. Speaker, at the expiration of 21 days, I will ask the Prime Minister the following question. Beg to give notice.
Order, please. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sittings of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained. Mrs. Williams.
Mr. Speaker, I now move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Income Tax Amendment Act 2018.
A bill shortly entitled the Income Tax Amendment Act 2018 read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice of second reading of the bill.
Public Business.
Mr. Speaker, today we have an interesting schedule. We will have legislation dealing with the Major Organized Crime and Anti-Corruption Agency Act 2018. The Senate amendments will be dealt with today by the Minister of National Security. We will have also the Toll Road Registers Regulations 2018 will be taken by the Honorable Minister of Transportation and Mining. Also, the Toll Roads Technical Designs, Operations and Maintenance Standards Regulations 2018 will also be taken by the Honorable Minister of Transportation and Mining. A bill shortly entitled the Ballast Water Management Act 2017 will also be taken, so he's going to be a very busy minister today. Debate to continue on the bill shortly entitled the Fisheries Act, long overdue now, and I know the minister is well armed with all the information, and his staff has been here for some time anxiously awaiting his presentation. And a bill shortly entitled the Trust Act will be taken by the Minister without portfolio in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. And then we will speedily go through those matters and have the sectorial debate by the last contributor, Dr. Wickham McNeil of Westmoreland, who will make his presentation. And then finally, the Minister of Agriculture will close the sectorial debate.
Minister.
The Toll Roads Registers Regulation Resolution 2018 and the Toll Roads Technical Designs, Operation and Maintenance Standards Regulation Resolution. Mr. Speaker, these are very straightforward and simple regulations, and the purpose of the regulations is to assist the toll authority with carrying out its administrative and regulatory functions. Both regulations were contemplated for the primary reason of improving the accountability of the concessionaires and the toll authority, as well as to give more definition to the powers of the toll authority. The Toll Roads Registers Regulation 2018 allows the authority to keep registers for annual toll road usage, incidents, annual collusion statistics, and complaints. The regulations also allow the concessionaires to have a quality management system which will be subject to internal audits at planned intervals to determine whether the activities conform with the quality management system and the quality management system is effectively implemented and maintained. The concessionaires shall also submit current and updated copies of operational and maintenance procedures to the authority. And Mr. Speaker, the Toll Road Technical Designs, Operation and Maintenance Standards Regulation. The toll authority has over time experienced several challenges relating to the operations and maintenance of the toll road in accordance with the provisions of the Concession Agreement and the Toll Road Act. The provisions of the Concession Agreement do not provide adequate provisions to address the breaches. Additionally, the system for penalty points which are provided in the concessions, as ineffective and laborious as they are, can only be implemented by the grantor, NRAC. In light of the foregoing, the Toll Road Technical Designs, Operation and Maintenance Standards Regulation 2018 requires a concessionaire intending to design, construct, or modify a toll road to adhere to the technical standards specified in the schedule of the regulations. Notwithstanding those listed in the schedule, other technical standards of international recognition may be submitted for consideration and approval. Applications, Mr. Speaker, for approval for a construction or modification will be submitted to the National Works Agency for approval. The regulations also refer to the design, construction, operation, and maintenance standards, specification, and requirements outlined in the concession agreement and requires that the concessionaire adhere to these. Those, Mr. Speaker, are the two sets of regulations that I want to put to the House for its ascension and concurrence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, just a few comments on this regulation. The Honourable Minister spoke to accountability by the toll operators, and they have a responsibility to adhere to certain standards. There are certain things that are happening at both toll roads that I'm hoping that this particular piece of legislation will now address. One is the undue congestion we have at the toll booths, especially during peak hours. In that, and the member from St. Catherine South can attest to that. The fact is that there are openings there are booths that are closed, but you have a long line of traffic. And secondly, on the East-West link, you have situations where, because of improper policing by the toll operators, you have situations where goats and other animals get onto the road, which creates a serious problems for the motorists who are using it. So these are some of the breaches for the motoring public, which it is my hope that this piece of legislation addresses in terms of their accountability to the motoring public. That's basically it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what the Minister has just tabled and started debate, the opposition has no objection, and we are fully on board with the regulations as is.
Booths there, and people are backed up. And excuse me, sir. I have to keep in touch with the transportation network in the island, and I also have to ensure that the transportation network is in tip-top shape, because there's a very active campaign going on for an organization, and I want to ensure that all the aspiring candidates arrive safely. So we will have some discussion with the toll authority, and the whole matter of the animals getting onto the link. We discussed that, and in large part it is as a result of theft of the fencing along the way. But that's no excuse, sir, and we will treat with it. Mr. Speaker, I would like to close the debate and ask that both motions be approved at this time.
The question is that the motions put by the Minister be approved. Those in favour? Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I also have on the Ballast Water Management Act. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica has signed the Ballast Water Management Convention from 2004. However, we have not been faithful to that agreement because we have not passed in our parliament the Ballast Water Management Act. And today is a historic day that we will be passing, hopefully, that act. Ballast water, Mr. Speaker, is carried into ships to maintain their stability and trim when they are being operated at sea in an empty or partially laden state. And the Ballast Water Management Convention of 2004 was adopted by the International Maritime Organization to provide a global legal framework for the regulation and management of the ship's ballast water and the sediments which remain in the tanks of the vessels after the ballast water has been discharged. Mr. Speaker, when especially our bauxite vessels or vessels that carry bulk cargo are operating from one port to the other and are empty, it is the practice that you take. In the old days, they used to take on stones to ballast the ship, to steady it in the rough seas. But over time, water has been used to ballast it. But what you find, Mr. Speaker, is that they discharge this water in our ports, and in the water are foreign species, and you can have contamination. There is a very, very strange case, I would call, of cholera being introduced into a port because they took on the water from one to another. The new convention, Mr. Speaker, asks that you take up the ballast water from the home port, and once you hit international water, it is discharged, and you take up international water. And when you get into the visiting port, you discharge the ballast water. But a lot of ships are not, Mr. Speaker, following the rules and the regulations, and Jamaica, having signed on to the treaty, also has to pass the necessary laws to give effect to the treaty. Approximately 10 billion tons of ballast water are being transferred globally on an annual basis, and approximately 10,000 species, including invasive aquatic species, were being carried each day in the ballast tanks of ships. The transfer of invasive aquatic species in the ballast has contributed to the collapse of fisheries, the increased risk of the spread of cholera, shellfish poisoning in humans, and increased maintenance costs on the part of power generating plants due to the fouling of their intake cooling pipes. In Jamaica, Mr. Speaker, the introduction of Asian green mussels found in the Kingston Harbor has been identified by the University of the West Indies as having been introduced into Jamaican waters via ballast water. Having regard to Jamaica's container transshipment activities, because, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica gets approximately 2,400 ship calls per year, and that is increasing. And each time a ship comes, you are at risk of being contaminated. The export of bulk cargo such as bauxite and alumina and aggregate, ships calling at Jamaican ports discharge their ballast water prior to the loading operation. Jamaica is therefore at risk of having invasive aquatic species being introduced into our maritime environment, as well as pathogens such as cholera being introduced into the country. Additionally, with the widening of the Panama Canal, the dredging of the Kingston Transshipment Terminal, and the recent opening of the bauxite plant in Nain, large foreign flag vessels currently trade with Jamaican ports and transit our territorial waters. The legislation will be administered by the Maritime Authority of Jamaica, which operates an international ship registry and a mega yacht registry. Mr. Speaker, in explaining the legislation, I'll do it in parts. Part one defines the legislation. The scope of the legislation extends to Jamaican ships anywhere they are in the world and foreign flag ships in Jamaican waters. Jamaican waters are interpreted to extend to our 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. The Maritime Authority, through the Director General, will be responsible for ensuring that both Jamaican and foreign flag ships comply with the legislation. Excluded from the application are ships which are designed not to carry ballast water, operate solely in restricted areas, as well as Jamaican government ships operated for non-commercial purposes. Part 2, Mr. Speaker, treats with the control and management of ships' ballast water and sediments. Ships are required to carry on board a ballast water management plan and a ballast water record book. The prescribed form of the record book is in the schedule to the bill. Additionally, ships based on their date of construction and the size of their ballast water tanks are required to exchange their ballast water in accordance with the legislation or install ballast water treatment systems which will prevent, reduce, or eliminate invasive species and pathogens. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, a part of the convention speaks to that the next time a ship goes to dry dock, they are required to fit a ballast water treatment system onto the ship. So it is said that within 8 to 10 years, all ships operating will have some kind of ballast water treatment system. A number of ship owners, however, have calculated that the system costs approximately $5 million US. And those that have older ships, what they are doing is upgrading the ships or just abandoning those ships and buy new ships. So we are ensuring with this piece of legislation that we adhere to the convention that we had signed, but we never had the domestic law to enforce the provisions of the convention. The bill requires that the director notifies masters or owners about the areas where the uptake of ballast water is prohibited. This is very important, Mr. Speaker, because of where Jamaica is situated. While our exclusive zone goes up to 200 nautical miles out, we do have the situation where we have neighboring countries closer than the 200 miles. And the convention asks that in that case, because our closest neighbor is 90 miles, which is Cuba, and then you have Haiti, which is pretty close, that 50 nautical miles should be the limit, or if you are closer than that, then predetermined sections in the ocean where the water is at least 200 meters deep ought to be used to take on ballast water before you carry that water into a home port. It is suspected by some people, but we have no definitive proof. Part 3, surveyors, surveys, and survey certificates. Control over Jamaican ships is exercised through the survey of the ships at specified periods and at the issuance of a certificate evidencing that the ship has the equipment, the ballast water record book, and a ballast water management plan. The form of the International Ballast Water Management Certificate is also set out in the schedule to the bill. The surveys of Jamaican ships will be conducted by surveyors appointed by the Maritime Authority of Jamaica and by classification societies such as Lloyd's Register of Shipping, which have been approved by the Maritime Authority. Surveyors have the authority to withdraw certificates from Jamaican ships which are not compliant. In Part 4, in the case of foreign ships in Jamaican waters, inspectors of the Maritime Authority of Jamaica may board these ships to determine whether they are in compliance with the legislation. The enforcement powers of the inspectors include detention of the ships until the discrepancies found have been rectified, the warning of the ship, or the exclusion of a non-compliant ship from our harbors or waters. Where the action of the inspector causes undue delays, the ship owner is entitled to compensation for any loss or damage incurred. Part 5, the sediment receptacle facilities. When ships pump ballast water in their tanks, the sediments in the water settle and over time accumulate in the bottom of the tank. The sediments may contain invasive aquatic species or pathogens, and the legislation provides for the establishment of sediment reception facilities to receive and treat these sediments. Penalties. The bill provides for penalties not exceeding 30 million Jamaican dollars for discharging ballast water in breach of the provisions and not exceeding 10 million Jamaican dollars for failing to produce a ballast water record book or making false entries into the book. The bill also gives the minister the power to introduce by affirmative resolution increases in the various fines. Mr. Speaker, I commend this bill to the House for its consideration and approval at the appropriate time.
Mr. Speaker, we welcome this legislation. As the Minister in his presentation stated that it has been a long time in coming. But we also why it is important is that we have a responsibility not only to the ships coming into our own ports, but also to the preservation of our own coral reefs and our aquatic life. So, Mr. Speaker, we on this side welcome this legislation and have no objection to the provisions in the legislation.
Minister.
I am very happy that we have concurrence on this bill, and I now ask that the bill be read a second time.
The question is that the bill be read a second time. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Clerk.
A bill entitled An Act to Give Effect to the Provisions of the International Convention for the Control and Management of Ships, Ballast, Water and Sediments, 2018.
The House will now resolve itself into a committee of the whole House to consider the bill clause by clause. I put clause 1. Clauses, I put part 1, clauses 1.
No, Mr. Speaker, the enacting clause needs to be changed from 2017 to 2018. And wherever, I'd also like to ask that wherever 2018 doesn't appear as a date, that we just correct to 2018. I am saying I want to change the date. So, the enacting clause, an act to give effect to the provisions of the International Convention for the Control and Management of Ships, Ballast Water and Sediments, 2014, ought to be 2018. You see how long it did it? That will be the only amendment in part 1.
Are we putting it as an amendment or it's just a correction?
It's a correction.
Correction. So I'm about to put put part 1, clause 1 to 3. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? As of it. I put part 2, clauses 4 to 17. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? As of it. I put part 3, clauses 18 to 30. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? As of it. I put part 4, clause 31. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? As of it. I put part 5, clause 32 to 38. Those in favor?
One amendment, Mr. Speaker.
You have an amendment?
Yes, sir. That we need to renumber clause 38 as clause 39 and it should read, the minister may amend monetary penalties. The minister may by order, subject to affirmative resolution, amend the monetary penalties in this act.
I put the amendment. Those in favor? Those against? I put clause 38 as amended. Those in favor? Those against? Members, please listen. I put clause 39. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. I put the schedule. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. I put the title and the enacting clause. Those in favor? I think we have an amendment there, or a correction. What do we have? Proceed. I put the title and enacting clause. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. The question is that I do report the bill as having passed committee stage with one amendment. One amendment. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Give Effect to Provisions of the International Convention for the Control and Management of Ships' Ballast, Water and Sediments, 2018, read a third time and passed.
Mr. Speaker,
Minister.
Yes. In light of the fact that the Prime Minister is not yet here, and we have two matters to be dealt with, the Fisheries Act and the Trust Act 2018, and I do not wish anyone to leave the chamber, because I know they have traveled afar to listen to the Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries, Agriculture, Industry, Commerce and Fisheries. So I'm going to ask that the ministerial portfolio in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation make his presentation now on the Trust Act 2018. Thereafter, we will invite the Minister of Agriculture to make his presentation on the Fisheries Act.
Mr. Vaz.
Hold on there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Permission to speak from a seat other than my own. Mr. Speaker.
You want him down there, sir? It's quite fine right here.
Mr. Speaker, the bill that is being placed before you today is cited as the Trust Act. Hereinafter, the bill. Mr. Speaker, as members of this Honourable House may be aware, there is no statute that provides for the establishment of governance of trusts in Jamaica. Presently, the regulations of the conduct of trustees is covered by the Trustees Act, a statute that was enacted in 1897. Let me repeat that, Mr. Speaker, 1897, and which is not in sync with today's commercial climate and the common law. It modernizing the law related to trusts. The bill will, among other things, codify the common law related to trusts, repeal the said Trust Act and amend sections 2, 7, and 21 of the Trustees, Attorney, and Executors Account and General Act 1973, and provide the savings and transitional provisions for the continuity and to preserve the validity and enforceability of trusts created under the Trustee Act. The bill will put in place a strong, modern, clear, and comprehensive law that will support other measures for the modernization and diversification of the economy. The stakeholders in the international financial services sector and the domestic trust services providers will be supported by this legislation. It is a significant step in furthering the mandate of the GIFSA's regime. Consequently, it addresses the needs of a modern economy in which the investment community has increased its use of trust as a vehicle to enhance the returns that may be earned from assets that are comprised in the trust. The bill includes provisions that will strengthen the regulatory environment and accountability standards to which trustees are to adhere. Further, it bolsters the protective measures for persons who are affected by the terms of a trust or provide services related to the trust, inclusive of trustees. The measures include the appointment of enforcers to ensure that the terms of the trust are executed by the trustee. The pertinent principles of the trust law addressed under this bill include provisions for creation, validity, duration, and enforceability of trusts, general fiduciary duties of trustees, including separation and preservation of trust property, impartiality, keeping accounts, and giving of information, the establishment, operation, and administration of trust services in Jamaica for both trust and foreign trust, protection for beneficiaries who are minors or persons under legal disabilities, and the liability and indemnification of trustees and the conditions to which this may apply. Mr. Speaker, I'll briefly outline parts of the bill, and the clause by clause is there for your detailed review. Mr. Speaker, the definition of key operational terms as used throughout the bill are provided in this part. Mr. Speaker, this act is retroactive and will apply to trusts created before the commencement of the act, except where otherwise provided in the act. Nature of trusts. Mr. Speaker, this part outlines how a trust is created and the characteristics which must be included in a trust to exist and be deemed valid. Provision is also made for the circumstances under which a trust will be deemed invalid and unenforceable in Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, this part comprises of 48 sections, which is further grouped under 7 subheadings. I will address the content of each subheading separately. Creation and duration of trust and beneficiaries of trusts. Mr. Speaker, a trust may be created by oral declaration or an instrument in writing and may be in existence for an unlimited period. However, unit trusts and trusts of real property must be created in writing. Mr. Speaker, provisions is made for how beneficiaries are identified in a trust and the right of a beneficiary to disclaim his interest in a trust in writing. The purpose of trust enforcer and protector of trusts. The appointment, role, and responsibility of the enforcer, who, Mr. Speaker, is a person appointed to ensure the execution of a non-charitable purpose trust, and the protector, who is appointed under the terms of the trust and capable of enforcing the trust in relation to the trust. Trustees. Mr. Speaker, provisions is made for the minimum of trustees to be 2, except in a specific circumstances, including only 1 trustee
was originally appointed or a corporate trustee residing in Jamaica is acting. Mr. Speaker, the subpart also provides for the rights, responsibility, resignation, or removal of a trustee. It specifies the nature of a trustee's interest in the trust property as being limited to which is necessary for the proper performance of the trust, and that the trust property does not form part of the trustee's estate. Trustee's statutory duty of care. Mr. Speaker, a trustee must exercise such care and skill as is reasonable in the circumstances and must exercise his functions in the utmost good faith and act in a prudent and responsible manner. This is his fiduciary duty to the trust. Power of trustees. Mr. Speaker, a trustee cannot delegate his functions unless permitted to do so by the Act or by terms of the trust. In the case of the government trustee, by provisions of the Insolvency Act. Mr. Speaker, under this part, a trustee is empowered to consult professional persons in relation to the affairs of the trust, sue and be sued in his capacity and in relation to trust or the trust property, and issue a renewable power of attorney in relation to functions vested in him as trustee, and ensure trust property, and to pay the premium out of trust funds. Remuneration and liability of trustee. Mr. Speaker, the trustee is entitled to charge and being reimbursed for all usual professional fees for services rendered in undertaking his role, and to be reimbursed for proper expenses incurred in carrying out his duties. A trustee may be liable for breach of trust under this Act. However, a trustee may be indemnified or relieved of liability for breach of trust by the beneficiary. Where the beneficiary is a minor or a person under legal disability, the trust may not be relieved of liability in such a manner. Payment into court by trustees. This part authorizes trustees to pay into court any monies or securities belonging to the trust in their hand or under their control, so that the court can deal with these monies and securities subject to the rules of the court. Part 3, protective trust, class interests, and certain powers. Mr. Speaker, the terms of a trust may provide limitations on the interests of a beneficiary in a trust, make any power or exercise of power under a trust revocable in whole or in part, or subject to be varied. Empower a settler, trustee, or any other person to appoint or assign trust property or any interest therein or for the benefit of any person. Mr. Speaker, this part also makes provision for the rules that will apply where a trust of interest under a trust is in favor of a specific class of persons, charitable or non-charitable purpose trust, and what is to obtain where the terms of a trust directs or authorizes the accumulation of income for any period. Failure and lapse and termination of trust. So, Speaker, this part provides that interests or property concerned with the trust will be held by the trustee for the settler absolutely, or for distribution by his personal representatives. Where an interest lapses, a trust is terminated, or there is no beneficiary or purpose in accordance with the terms of the trust, or the property is vested in a person otherwise for his sole benefit, but the trust on which he is to hold the property are not declared or communicated to him. So, Speaker, the part also notes that where a trust is terminated, the trust property must be distributed by the trustee within a reasonable time in accordance with the terms of the trust. Part 5, Mr. Speaker, jurisdiction, rules, and powers of court, dispute resolution, etc. So, Speaker, Supreme Court Judicial of Jamaica has jurisdiction in respect of a Jamaican trust and a foreign trust, where the trustee of the foreign trust resides in Jamaica, property of the foreign trust is situated or administered in Jamaica, or the terms of the trust creating the foreign trust provide that the court is to have jurisdiction. Special protection is established in relation to the variation of a trust on behalf of a child or a person of legal disability. Mr. Speaker, any such variation can only be done by order of the court. So, Speaker, the power to sanction sale of land or minerals separately is retained in this Act. Mr. Speaker, Though this part speaks to the role of the court in the administration of the trust, it also provides for the use of alternative dispute resolution. These include conciliation, mediation, early neutral evaluation, adjudication, expert determination, and arbitration. Disposition to or by a trust. Mr. Speaker, this part applies to an action or proceeding relating to the disposition to or by a trust or an entity owned or controlled by a trust, and any proceedings by a creditor alleging fraud or cause of action founded in fraud against a settler, a trust, or an entity owned by the trust. So, Speaker, this part also outlines the circumstances under which a disposition will not be found as void or voidable in relation to an acting or proceedings for fraud or case of action founded in fraud will fail and the disposition. Mr. Speaker, the specific limitation periods within which a creditor may bring a case of action are set out in this part. 7, foreign trust. Mr. Speaker, a foreign trust is unenforceable in Jamaica to the extent that it is not in the form of a written instrument, purports to do anything contrary to the laws of Jamaica, confers or imposes any right or function, the exercise or discharge of which would be contrary to the laws of Jamaica, and the court declares it to be immoral or contrary to public policy. 8, Mr. Speaker, miscellaneous. Mr. Speaker, trust property dealt with in breach of the trust is recoverable so long as it is identifiable and not in the hands of a bona fide purchaser for value without notice of the breach of trust. So, Speaker, it is important to note that a trustee who commits a breach of the trust will be personally liable for damages whether or not the property is in his hands or a bona fide purchaser for value without notice of the breach of trust. So, Speaker, the following is noted. There is no limitation period for actions brought against a trustee in respect of fraud. There is no limitation period for actions brought against a trustee to recover the trust property or proceeds thereof. And actions founded in breach of trust must be brought against a trustee within 3 years from the date on which a claimant first had knowledge of the breach. Mr. Speaker, where the claimant was a minor or a person under legal incapacity at the time of any breach of trust, the 3 years is calculated from the date on which his guardian first has knowledge of the breach. The claimant ceases to be a child or a person under legal disability. Mr. Speaker, a trust estate will not be affected by a trustee becoming a convict. Mr. Speaker, Part 9, the General. Mr. Speaker, the Minister is empowered by this part to make regulations for the better operations of the provisions of the Act where it is deemed necessary, and these regulations will be subject to affirmative resolution. Mr. Speaker, this Act must be reviewed by a jointly selected committee of both Houses of the Parliament no later than 5 years after the commencement of this Act. The Trustee Act of Jamaica repealed by virtue of this section, and the Trustees, Attorneys, and Executors, Accounts and General Act is amended in Section 2 in the definition of trustee by deleting the words Trustee Act and substituting them with the words Trust Act. Finally, Mr. Speaker, savings and transitional. This part outlines these functions, dispositions, and actions taken prior to the commencement date of this Act that will remain unaffected by this Act coming into effect, including anything done in relation to a trust before the commencement date and the functions under any provision of any law of a guardian or an attorney. Transitional provisions give privilege to those action taken under the Trustees Acts which could be done under this Act, and the effect as if it was done after the commencement of this Act. Mr. Speaker, the Trust Acts, which seeks to modernize the statutory regime and regulations of trusts in Jamaica, is now tabled for consideration. Thank you.
Mr. Samuel.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, the opposition has advised that they will respond.
Your mic, your mic.
Straight into the presentation by the Minister of National Security on the Major Organized Crime and Anti-Corruption Agency Act 2018.
Dr. Shah.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I will be taking the amendments from the Senate amendments on the Major Organized Crime Anti-Corruption Agency Act 2018. We start the debate today, explain the amendments as outlined and circulate. I go through them quickly, and we hope to close it today. I will point out the major changes. There are some 77 amendments on the bill, which really many of them sought to strive to correct. Well, I think we passed with 61 amendments in the House. We now have 77 from the Senate. Many of them, of course, are minor changes, as indicated here, but there are a number of significance I'll point out. Section 2(4), Registration of Births and Deaths Act was repealed by the Section 4 because of the repeal of the National Identification Deaths Act, and the National Identification Registration Act A was amended to reflect the Registrar General of Births and Deaths in Jamaica within the meaning of the Registration of Births and Deaths Act. So basically a technical amendment to ensure that we will refer to the appropriate order in due course. The next major change really came in Clause 9, where we deleted Section 3, which was of concern to several members of the House. You'll recall that Section 3 of Clause 9 gave the Minister gave the authority to give instructions to the Director General. The entire clause was deleted, and therefore we proceed along those lines. Section 16, Clause 16 was amended to be consistent with the method of appointment stated in Clause 12 above. Therefore, the government of one of the listed grounds General from office on the recommendation of the Prime Minister after consultation with the leader of the opposition. However, to safeguard against arbitrary and for preserving the rule of law, we have legislated mechanism to assist the Governor General in making his determination whether the Director General should be removed from office. For this purpose, a tribunal consists only of individuals who hold or has held office as a judge of the court, having unlimited jurisdiction in civil and criminal matters in the Commonwealth. So that GG will now be required to make that amendment before finalizing dismissal after the recommendation by the Prime Minister on consultation with the opposition. Clause 22, concern raised during the Senate debate regarding the borrowing powers of the agency, and a similar concern was raised by Minister Montague. As such, reference to the borrowing powers of the agency have been removed. Nevertheless, we should note that by virtue of Section 5 of the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, the entity will be able to exercise borrowing powers with the prior approval of the Minister of Finance. Clause 23, it was pointed out that maybe the Auditor General was omitted from those who would perform auditing functions, and that was reinstituted. Clause 31, subclause 3 has been amended to the effect that the Director General cannot decline to facilitate exchange of information to strategic partners or law enforcement agencies on the basis that they failed to undertake to make a contribution towards the cost of the exchange. This amendment was precipitated by comments by the opposition that essentially stated that strategic partners and law enforcement agencies are part of the local security architecture working towards the same objective. We agree. And therefore, the clause was so amended, which means, although it's a Clause 31, which originally had given them, the Director General, the right to decline to facilitate any exchange of information if the requesting body did not participate in financing, had the right to do so. We have taken that out altogether. And the Senate approval. The old bit is Clause 33, paragraph D, is a pause directive that should be so important to, that the committee should be so empowered to conduct their own investigation, not to seek external assistance in the case of the person for whom assistance is being sought on the investigation by MOCA. If you read that, this was where a carte blanche power was given to the oversight committee to call on any agency to assist them in investigating MOCA if they were concerned about a case. We figure that should not be, that should have been done under very special circumstances, that power was removed. Because the concern is that since MOCA is investigating corruption of all, if they are investigating corruption in another agency and the committee then calls another agency, it would lead to a conflict of interest. So there has to be some, that could not be made to remain as a complete and broad authority. All right. That was Clause 33. It's essentially, they have the power to seek assistance. I think it is they would do so in their own accord, and if they need request, then they'll have to examine to the ministers or other heads of agencies that we are sure are not under investigation. Let me, what original clause right now? If you read the original 33, I know, he's just asking. All right, okay, almost finished. We just remove section D, section D, all right? Okay, all right. Yeah, from the old, yeah. The primary amendment, in fact, was the inclusion of Schedule 7. The primary amendment that you should take a look at is the inclusion of 7th schedule, which outlines the powers of the director in greater detail than it was in the original bill. And they're quite wide-ranging powers, which we had agreed to, but they are now documented here in terms of the powers of arrest. So the arrest of a person with a warrant on certain cases, arrest of a person with warrant, entry, search, and seizure, as directed by the Director General, power to stop, search specified equipment with warrant, power to stop and search specified equipment with warrant, and application of Proceeds of Crime Act. That, I think, was a major amendment. Mr. Speaker, bringing this bill to the House today is a very significant day in this development of the security architecture. MOCA is an autonomous body which has principal responsibility to investigate corruption, but as outlined in the bill, it has a number, in the schedule of the bill, it focuses on a number of major activity, major criminal activity, and in fact will create a body that I think the country and the House can have great confidence in, that will bring about significant improvement in our capacity to deal with organized crime and corrupt activity in the country. In fact, it's a credit of Jamaica to have created such an agency. They are relatively small, but they have some really highly skilled, committed, professional young Jamaicans. And we have, The legislation itself is designed to protect that integrity and autonomy and ensure that Jamaica can have this kind of body which should be seen in a special way, particularly Jamaica, to deal with organized criminal activity and corruption. I'd like to that is my hope that we can have this close today, Mr. Speaker. Unless it's Clause 60, I'll move for the amendment to be adopted by the House.
Mr. Jackson.
Mr. Speaker, the opposition offers no objection to the amendments emanating from the Senate in this legislation that began here. A couple of observations I will make, Mr. Speaker. I have become a disciple of the belief that major legislations are best when subjected to joint select committees of the House. It allows for more detail and focus examination by both chambers of the House. And I just want to recommend that going forward, Minister, legislations, and you have indicated a number of legislations that will come to the House as part of the security architecture, be tabled with adequate time that it can be subject to review and participation by both members of both Houses. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, I just want to urge the Minister that upon the passage of this bill today, that we move post-haste for the coming into being of the legislation so that the intended objectives of having MOCA as an independent investigative body be in place, and so it can pursue its adequate funding to carry out its task. It is even more urgent, Mr. Speaker, in light of the many cases of corruption that is being brought to our attention and for which MOCA presently is currently involved. We know about the Petrojam matter, we know about the Nessal matter, and a number of others for which MOCA is playing a pivotal role. And in order to preserve, at least to give assurance to the country at large that the state, I'm starting there, more to come, and they will be so equipped, Mr. Speaker, to carry out their task with alacrity and let the chips fall where they may. Mr. Speaker, I do give my support to the amendment before us.
Dr. Shaw.
Let me thank my colleagues for their support for this bill. It's a very important piece of legislation to be brought by this House, and I think the House can take some pride in bringing this bill to the conclusion. I will ensure and make every effort, as you have requested, that we get this thing through quickly, and MOCA will be fully established as an autonomous investigating body. They have already proven themselves, although they are still very much a department of the police. Recall that in one local authority, I think they charged as much as 6 individuals in the famous Manchester activity, and that has gone before. And they have demonstrated the capacity to investigate in a fair, independent, and transparent way anywhere it is required. And therefore, we look forward to the operation. I said it will give greater confidence to those to our own people in this country about the capacity of our government, meaning government as a whole, to clean up the corruption practice in this country. Their budget is in place. At the moment, I think they are less than half of their establishment, right? We intend for that to be corrected very quickly, but they take time to recruit the quality staff they require. And from what I have seen in my short stint there, they have some real, as I said, young, bright professionals to make and so, can feel good or involved in this kind of thing and be proud of. in their station. And I expect the director will move very quickly to get this problem going. In fact, although they are better enumerated than some section of the security forces, one of the challenges that has emerged already, whenever they're doing work in the private sector, which they are also entitled to do, investigating corruption in financial institutions, for example, the institution end up offering them very lucrative contracts to come work for them, because they really have not only, they're talented, they're well trained, and I said have the capacity to deal really with the kind of problem we're thinking. And this government feels very strongly that we need this agency, and we'll do everything to ensure that the law comes on stream, but finance it. Because one of the unfortunate features of our politics, and I mean that generally, is that we end up damaging the political process by innuendos, inferences, and allegations which are often unfounded, and has gone on for all our years of independence. Major charges are laid out, allegations made, and the first charge make the headlines. So the front page of the newspaper, people's character challenged, damaged, and corrupt brush rubbed paint across the entire political process. What we are looking at is that an agency of this sort, now having prosecuting powers and investigating powers, can now begin to at least reset the operation, and where corruption is, it will be dealt with in a satisfactory manner. And where it does not exist, it will, the other agency can say, look, this is so, and the country can feel comfortable and confident that this is what is happening, so that the people of the country can feel more comfortable in what, and rest assured that the governments of the day, whatever government it is conducting the business in a manner with integrity and confidence, and those who deviate will be identified and charged. Well, Mr. Speaker, I now ask the Senate amendments to the Major Organized Crime Anti-Corruption Agency Act 2018 as considered be approved.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, we will now have the presentation on the fisheries bill. It's going to be closed today by the Minister of Agriculture, but the member from South Manchester wishes to make a contribution. I might remind the House that anything that you might miss in the chamber is always available on Hansard.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support the Fisheries Act, this bill that is being put forward, and to say it is quite timely and it is long overdue in regulating the fishing industry in Jamaica. As a member of Parliament for South Manchester, where the Alligator Pond Fishing Village is located, we have seen where fisher folks they have been impacted in a negative way, where we have seen where from time to time fisher folks go missing at sea, and they normally go missing without any compensation. So the insurance policy which is being devised in this bill here will go a long way in assisting the families of those persons who have been impacted in a negative way. And so I welcome it. The fisher folks in Alligator Pond in particular have always been asking for subsidy as it relates to the petrol. And I believe when our member here, Dr. Ferguson, spoke on it, he mentioned it, and the fisher folks have asked me to lend my voice to this bill to ensure that this one also takes place. We have suffered, Mr. Minister, Mr. Speaker, from what we call climate change in those areas there. We have seen where the erosion has taken place significantly, and where we have seen where the fisher folks have been impacted, and they would welcome NEPA in assisting in this regard here to ensure that the seashores are rescued and that something is done to alleviate the suffering there. We have seen where the sea is coming into the land and the houses are being impacted, the livelihood of several of the citizens there is being impacted. And so we would want this also to be part of this legislation as we move forward. And so I support this bill and look forward that we will get necessary assistance in this regard. I thank you.
Mr. Strait.
Mr. Speaker, may I also support the intent of this legislation and wish to point out two major impediments to the full growth of the fishing industry in Jamaica, which probably occupies close to 200,000 persons directly and many more indirectly. I use the example of the Raytown Beach, one of the first organized beaches in the modern fishing industry in Jamaica, which has been adversely affected in two ways. First, the up until recently unrestrained pollution in Kingston Harbor. And government is going to have to be mindful to correlate its environmental policies with its agriculture and fishery policies, because in this case, the catch of fish in Kingston Harbor, the shrimp over on the western side of the harbor, and the snapper and other parrotfish in the eastern harbor have been severely compromised. And indeed, and as a result, the livelihood of a number of fisherfolk have been compromised over the last 2 generations. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if you know that the fish that you buy on the Raytown Beach now comes usually from Rocky Point in Clarendon. So denuded is the supply in the harbor. But it goes wider than that, Mr. Speaker, because while the arrangements to better regulate the fishing industry are no doubt welcome, Jamaica as a whole, and we the elected leaders, have to look at the prospect of improving our fish stocks, which are severely depleted. Nowadays, the 12 and 15 feet boats that come out from Raytown, and I dare say from Greenwich Town and other areas, are severely pressed when they have to go long distances. And in the case of the last 2 months where there's been heavy breeze, the income in the area has been severely diminished. And this has an impact, of course, on paying school fees, on proper nutrition, on general livelihood. And what I'm hoping is that beyond this legislation, and because of this legislation, the intent to look at how we can apply modern science, perhaps within the context of our refreshed CARICOM and Caribbean initiatives, we can seek to replenish the valuable marine stocks which we have profligately diminished over many years. The other issue that is of great significance, and again requires joined-up government, is of course the issue of the robbing of fish pots, the theft of resources, marine resources, by some of our nearest neighbors. And I am happy that, from all I've heard, there is an increased enablement to the Coast Guard of Jamaica in recent times, and that a part of their remit must be to protect the fishing industry on the south coast of Jamaica and wherever. So putting the industry in order, providing for all of the measures that we have embodied in this legislation is a good first step. But making fishing an economic enterprise once again in Jamaica is the challenge that we must now turn to, and we must now, I would hope, engage perhaps a revised committee on economy in this House, where we could bring in people who can look at how we are going to renew the profitability of this industry. The bare bones of the law is merely the scaffolding of what we have to do. We now have to enflesh it with the actual stocks that are going to make it possible for us to have that vibrant fishing industry and for the law to recognize its potential. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, just to respond to the member from Manchester, is that South Manchester, in relation to the issue that he raised with the Alligator Pond Fishing Beach, just to indicate that that whole stretch is one of the areas, along with the Hellshire Beach, is two of the major projects that are being looked at through the climate change division of the ministry, and I will be more than prepared to share the details with him in due course.
Mr. Speaker.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to commend the Minister for bringing the bill to the House so that we can have it passed today. A number of us have had brief workings with this bill over time. In my stint there after I took over from Minister Roger Clark, who did some work on this bill, and I continued that program, and I'm happy to see that, well, Minister Samuda continued it as well, and this is now the time for Minister Shaw to have it passed in the House. So it has been long out there in gestation. A lot of effort has gone into it. There has been a lot of consultation in putting this bill together between the various persons involved in the fishing industry at all different levels. And I think what has been presented here is a reasonable first start of a bill that will help to regulate and to protect the fishing industry in Jamaica and the waters around for a long time to come. I don't think the bill is by no means perfect at this stage, but as we go along, we will find it may be necessary to make those adjustments as we go along the line, Minister. And as it relates specifically to the securing of our fish stocks, because as you are aware, the fish stocks in certain areas have been depleted. And fishermen have to travel much further out at sea now to get certain species of fish that they normally would have caught closer inland. And the use of the fish sanctuaries that are out there, we need to see more fish sanctuaries established, because it is the fish sanctuaries that are going to enable the protection and the development of those small fish and those species that are caught sometimes before they reach maturity, most times. And you're aware that the nets that some people use are not in conformity with the law, because the nets are the mesh and the nets are too large, are too small in some instances, so that the small species are able to be caught when they ought not to be caught. And the protection of the sanctuaries is important, and you have to give more teeth, as much teeth as possible, to the persons who are responsible for protecting the sanctuaries. Because you know how the Jamaican fishermen operate. And you know, most people don't like to follow rules and regulations. And the moment you start, I went out here myself to look at the work in Oracabessa at the fish sanctuaries, and was very pleased to see in my time how the stocks were replenishing and building up. It was very good. and the whole, the work that is being undertaken out there is very good. So we would like to see more effort, more assistance and support given to those persons who are asked to maintain the sanctuaries. Most times it's NGOs that take on this kind of work. So, from the ministry point of view, we have to make sure we do much more to ensure that we secure these fish sanctuaries to enable the sustenance of the fishing industry. The second point has to do, Minister, with the business of the security of our waters. Because the truth of the matter is, I don't think we have the full capacity to secure our fishing zones, the wider archipelago. We don't have it. We don't have the equipment, and we don't have the resources. But if we are really to ensure that we control properly all the fishing assets that we have within our waters for the benefit of the Jamaican people and the Jamaican economy, then we have to do something that will enable us to get to the point where we can ensure the protection of our waters and the proper policing of it. I won't mention the poaching issue. I'm sure you are very well aware of those issues over time, that people from Central America especially have come into our waters and removed our stocks, lobsters, conch, all sorts of stuff that we have here. And the fact that we have other species that are just coming on now, like the sea cucumbers and those other stuff that we will have to take charge of. So there's a lot of resources out there, Minister, and this bill really is a good step towards ensuring that we can control and reap the benefits of our waters. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just wanted to make one observation, and I would endorse what has been said about the how pleased we are that this bill is arriving. It's had a very long history and gestation. Yes. Just one comment I would make on it, and I believe probably there will be some more comments made about in the Senate on when they review it. But the structure of it, I think, betrays its longevity, the longevity of its gestation, because we are now in an era where we're committed to public sector transformation, and the elimination of duplication, the extraction of efficiencies, the elimination of a proliferation of agencies and so on, and streamlining the public sector so that it can deliver services required by the public in the most efficient way possible and at the least cost to taxpayers. Here we have a bill which creates three bodies. It creates an authority under Clause 5, the National Fisheries Authority, which will have a CEO. It will have a board. The board under the first schedule maybe, I believe, entitled to some form of remuneration, I'm not sure. It creates a council under Clause 10, which is a National Fisheries Advisory Council. And it creates an appeal tribunal as well, comprising 6 persons, 2 of whom will be attorneys at law, and who may also be entitled to remuneration for their services. So we have 3 new bodies being created by one bill. I think that this bucks a trend of where we're trying to go in terms of the public sector transformation. And as I say, I suspect that if this bill wasn't so long in coming, perhaps the structure would be different in this regard. I think the time has come, Mr. Speaker, for there to be some consolidation of the appeal tribunals that we have being created under statute. We have many statutes which provide for licensing and so on that create these appeal tribunals. I think the time has come to look at consolidating the various appeal tribunal into some fit-for-purpose entity that can serve multiple purposes under statute. This is it, for example, in the UK, they have gone the route of having specialized tribunals that deal with fairly broad terms of functionality in different areas, first-tier and second-tier tribunals, covering a range of activities that have some commonality. So, for example, in the agricultural industry, we have fishing, we have JACRA, which has been formed, the agricultural commodities, that has an appeal tribunal, I believe, and so on. In the financial services area, there are several of these things. So I'm just saying, I think the time has come where we need to look at how we deal with these appeal bodies and try and find some method of consolidating rather than having such a proliferation of them. I thought I'd mention that simply because it did. Yes, of course we should cooperate on it. We should cooperate on all such matters. Yes, yes, yes. But I only mentioned it, as I say, because it did strike me as being somewhat inconsistent with the general thrust or direction that we're trying to go in streamlining and reducing the proliferation of entities that exist in the public sector. Apart from that, I'm sure the fishing industry will be pleased that they're having a modern fisheries statute, and I hope that it will inure to the benefit of our fisher folk and, of course, our fishing stocks, which have suffered terribly over the years from overfishing and from abusive fishing practices. The bill, therefore, has my support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll be brief, but as a former member of parliament for an area with a number of fishing beaches and catering to the needs of a number of fisher folk, and then a former minister of agriculture who contributed to the development of this bill, I want to just make a brief intervention around first of all, the importance of the bill, which I fully support and think it will bring the rules of engagement in this important area into the modern era, which for a long time needed to be done. In fact, the length of time that this piece of legislation or this bill has taken demonstrates how lacking we are in terms of governing the activities of these particular segment of the population. But a more general comment, though, Mr. Speaker, my intimate knowledge with the fisher folk across Jamaica, I understand about 17,000 to 18,000 are registered, approximately 20,000 or so overall, and if you apply the numbers in terms of dependents, family members and children, you're looking by a factor of 4, easily 60,000 to 80,000 Jamaicans who are impacted. My limited knowledge of the activities of these fisher folk on these fishing beaches across the country is that they live on the margins of society for the most part. The infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, on these fishing beaches are inadequate. I'm talking about from basic sanitary conveniences, bathroom facilities, docking facilities. It's just woefully inadequate. Safety-related information, support, and while I think the legislation addresses the issues related to enforcement and hopefully some support in terms of encouraging compliance in terms of safety standards and so on, I don't think it goes into supporting an enabling environment sufficiently to help these fisherfolk to move from the margins of society into a more self-sustaining economic expansion mode. And I think that's a lacking element. Now, perhaps that will be supported with additional policy, and the minister, I'm sure, could comment on that either now or later on, because this may be the foundation for other things to come. But I certainly would urge the minister, urge my own cabinet colleagues, both sides of the aisle here in this House, to use this as a starting point, a base to advance the environment, to enable our fisherfolk across Jamaica to empower themselves, to see this as a tool for greater levels of economic empowerment. Because as I said before, right now, for the most part, most of these fisherfolk live on the margins of society with a lot of dependence, and the least disruption, environmental disruption or otherwise, does create significant hardships for them. Mr. Speaker, one example of this economic empowerment is the extent to which we can assist them to migrate from being basic artisanal fishers folk, just fishing enough for tomorrow's meal with minimal trading to support the other basic essentials in life, and helping them to expand their activity. For example, Mr. Speaker, going further out as opposed to just fishing in the immediate environs of the coastline, which clearly limits their options, which is also unsustainable in terms of the fish replenishing itself, but also providing even bigger opportunities for export. I mean, I'm told, for example, that in terms of the docking stations, the infrastructure to support large-scale fishing, processing, and export, these are quite limited. I'm told probably 4 or 5 around the country that offers that kind of critical infrastructure to allow fisherfolk to think on a grander scale as opposed to the sort of artisanal self-subsistence type of activity. And again, I would say to the minister, to my colleagues, that we need now a plan, another plan, in addition to what is here. I think this is a great start. I want to commend the minister and former ministers, the immediate minister before this minister, who sits in another capacity, the minister directly in front of me on this side, and others on that side too, who have played a part in getting this to this stage. But I really do believe that this is a starting point of a journey to modernizing the industry. And I think our fisherfolk deserves a bit more encouragement, starting with basic infrastructure in our fishing beaches. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, just permit me to just permit me to make a few comments on the act itself, and really to take up on a theme struck by the speaker just before me, which really goes to the recognition, the growing recognition of the blue economy and the opportunities that it represents for Jamaica and for the Caribbean countries as a whole. That theme was struck at the recent Heads of Government conference, and I believe that what it symbolizes, or what it represents, is that growing recognition that the exclusive economic zones, the significant water resource that it represents throughout the region, is one of the untapped resources for the region and for Jamaica, to be sure. I want to take up where the speaker before me left off, which is about going beyond the near shore and the artisanal fishery, because the Act itself addresses some key elements. One is the scientific research, which I think is very, very important. The other recognizes the importance of strengthening the enforcement measures. seizing vessels and addressing some of the vagaries of theft, really, from poachers into our own waters. And I think the Act strengthened the provision, the existing provisions there. But what I want to hope is that this architecture, this new architecture, provides the minister with an opportunity for greater planning and strategy planning going forward, having regard to the tremendous resources that are available to us in the blue economy. And I think you mentioned in your budget presentation, your sector, your contribution, the opportunities for the blue economy. That blue economy has now to recognize and take advantage of a couple facts. One, significant work was done by previous administration to put in place delimitation treaties, border delimitation treaties. And I think it is fair to say that Jamaica has successfully completed most, if not all, of the delimitation with our neighbors, with our near neighbors. And therefore we have a number of delimitation agreements. What that provides and what that enables is for fishing agreements, cooperation agreements, to be now put in place as a basis for fully exploiting the resources around us, and also to give and to encourage large processors, because it is one of the features of our economy today that we have large processors. Some of them, rainforests, for example, seafood. We know of other large fisher person, Bonnie Francis and his operation that he started, and others. But there are indeed large processors with the capability for deep sea fishing and processing on board the vessels, and by extension, exports that goes along with it. And so, Minister, I think that this provides you with another element in the toolbox. But we already have delimitation agreements. And I think the neighboring states, I know for a fact, when I served at another ministry, were eager then and remain eager to engage in fishing agreements that can not only delimit, but take advantage of not only exclusionary provisions, which is contained in this piece of legislation, but to look forward to enabling provisions that fishing agreements would provide to help and to assist the expansion of the fishing industry here in Jamaica and the export fishing industry. So I think this legislation, the scientific research, of course, is critical because you have to engage in sustainable fishing and that capability. And I hope that that is resourced, because the extent to which you're able to allow for fishing to take place really should be on the basis of sustainability. The international community recognizes it, requires that. And treaties that we are parties to requires that we allow not only fishing but sustainable fishing. So we have, I think, modernized, put legislation in place that will help to modernize the sector, and I believe there's a lot more available to you now, Minister, as tools to enable you to fully exploit the emerging blue economy. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to give my support to this bill, which is entitled the Act to Repeal the Fishing Industry Act, to provide for the efficient and effective management and sustainable development of fisheries, aquaculture, and other related activities in accordance with internationally recognized norms, standards, and best practices, and to provide for matters connected therewith and incidental thereto. Mr. Speaker, I too represent a constituency with a fishing village and also one of the largest fishing exporters in the island, if not in the Caribbean. And it was only last week that that cohort indicated to me the need for a modern legislative framework to deal with the fishing industry. And so this bill today is coming at a timely juncture. It has gestated for a long time. And one of the downsides when bills are in the system for such a long time is that developments take place and sometimes the bills do not benefit from further review to ensure that they are in keeping with the most up-to-date standards. But Mr. Speaker, in particular, I just want to put on record for those constituents in my St. James West Central constituency who raised the issue with me that under Clause 109, the Minister is empowered to make regulations, and there are existing regulations. Under the new bill, regulations are to be made in particular for the handling, possession, disposal of fish and aquaculture products, and import, export, distribution, and marketing. Again, on behalf of that set of constituency, Mr. Speaker, to the Honourable Minister, there is need for modernizing of those regulations. There are existing regulations, and they will continue to apply until new regulations are passed. But they say for those who operate across the region in more than one territories, that comparatively what obtains in Jamaica is unnecessarily bureaucratic and hinders a timely operation. And in the process, they incur more costs and also experience loss of product simply because of the steps that are involved in the inspection. And there are other jurisdictions where it's done with greater ease and they meet all of the sanitary standards in the nations that they export to. So on behalf of those constituents, I place on record the special request to ensure that they are also consulted in the process of updating the regulations. The bill has my support. May it so please you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And let me thank the honourable members, including the opposition spokesman on agriculture. Okay, that's not me, all right? That's not me.
Okay. Members. Okay. Members. Yeah. Yep. Members.
Hello.
All right, we adjourn until we suspend the sitting until we have better and further particulars.
Mando, I throw away all childish behavior and just know say I'm on time.
When my son needed a real role model, I stepped up to the plate and show him that even though you make mistakes, you can move on and be a better person.
we have to start acting like men. There comes a time you gotta put away childish things. Keep your pants up to your waist, because you're role models to the younger ones.
An example that I think grown men should set for young men